fit in, as we saw, in some way to the family tree. But what I really want to get across today is that I have a normal life. You know, this is not what I do for a living. This is just a passion that I have that I've had since I was a little kid. I've always been fascinated with World War II, particularly aviation. I was never in the Air Force, but I do have a pilot's license, just private, little four-seater. So in some sense, I can relate to how difficult it was for these guys, these kids, really, to train to get to the point of where they're flying these airplanes, any airplanes, and then go into a combat zone and risk their lives. And some of them, like Bob, gave their lives. So to me, in my interest in the topic, there are never enough hours for me to pour into this to really put the story together. So my purpose today really is it's a milestone. So this is the only time I've ever done this. I've presented many, many times for work, but this is really fun for me to share this with you because I believe that a lot of the information should be very close to you as family and friends. And also, a lot of it probably is stuff you've never heard before. And so that'll kind of get into the story as I go through the slides. Here are the topics I'd like to cover. So some of it is really detailed, and I can just kind of blow through it. Some of it is pretty intriguing, so I might spend a little bit of time on each slide. There are a lot of slides. So I'll take you through a story, and the story is really my fascination as a boy in World War II aviation, and wondering, do we have heroes in our family? And the answer is yes, of course. Most everybody does. And what I did in my search, which started about 12 years ago, to find out about the heroes in our family, one of which we'll talk about today, and a couple of which I'll touch on, but really we're going to focus on Bob. Again, there are books literally written specifically about the 487, so I'm not going to try to paint the best picture about my knowledge of the 487. I'll do the best I can and how it relates to Bob, but those are deep dives that are, other experts who are really the experts have written about. And I'm in contact with those guys. I'm in contact with people on message boards in Germany. So there are good sources of information. But my story really weaves around, Bob's involvement. So a little bit about the training, a little bit about his aircraft, the B-24H, the bomb group that he was in, 47, where they went, where they trained, where they ended up getting deployed, and then the missions. They weren't there very long before they went down. And I'll talk about the mission where they were shot down. And that's really where I've done a lot of deep dive. And then kind of rounding out the presentation will be more information about who the bad guys were. I've read a lot of books that are very compelling because they have interviews from all sides of the theater. From the U.S., of course, because it was easier to get the information, but also from Germans or the occupied country. So Pulitz is the German way to say it. Police is the Polish way to say it. Pulitz, the city where they were shot down, is actually in Poland. But at that time, as you probably know, Germany invaded Poland, so it was all the cities' names were changed to be German names. So that makes research extremely confusing. And I thought Police, which is spelled like police, like the police department, was somewhere completely different until like after the first couple of years of research, because then I realized, oh well, I'm wrestling between German names and Polish names, and I'm probably mispronouncing some of them. Okay, so let's get started. This all started when I finally made time to ask my mom, okay, who were these heroes? And she could think of two. Now my folks now are 85, so they were in their 70s, and she could remember two folks that were family members who flew in World War II or were on planes in World War II. One was Bob, and one was Jack Eckberg. So I don't know how I picked, but I started with Bob and just started doing research. Jack couldn't really find that much stuff at first, and maybe that was it. Maybe, I don't remember the reason, but I'm glad that I went the path that I did. But as you saw in Jim's chart, Jack is part of the family too. The Eckbergs were part of the family too at some point. But my mom's recollection was, I remember there was a pilot and they were in the Pacific and they went down and no one ever heard from them again. And I was like, okay. And with Jack, she just didn't remember his exploits at all. So after research, after hearing this and trying to do some initial research, I was really driven to find out what really happened. And as we know, they weren't in the Pacific. They were shot down, but the story was completely different. So my initial inspiration was, I owe this to my mom, who knew this guy, to find the truth. What really happened. And so the culmination of my efforts is exponentially, realized with all of you. Now I can share a lot of this with you. The email just shows, I've been working on this a while. I probably put more time into this presentation than in the last week, 2 weeks, than I have in the last 5 years collectively. So there's ebbs and flows. I remember going 3 or 4 years where I didn't have any time to work on research. There were, back in 2010, I had a few months where I had some downtime, and I was able to go to the archives every day. And by the archives, I mean the National Archives and Records Administration, National Archives. And they have a facility in College Park, Maryland, which is not on the mall in DC, but it's where the really big warehouse is. If you've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, the very last scene when they're rolling the Ark of the Covenant into that huge warehouse, it's pretty much like that, underground, and no public is ever allowed down there. But they have so much stuff you can't even, it's impossible to imagine, which makes challenges for digitization of information. You would think that it would all be digital by now. There's just too much stuff. There's film, there's pictures, there's documents, there's artifacts. I mean, it's unbelievable. So I was able to spend a lot of time and got a lot of the information you'll see today from those trips in 2000. So I have some information that's a little bit different, in addition to what Jim portrayed, and some of it may not be accurate for all intents and purposes. But a lot of the stories were the same for my dad. Okay. But I did a little digging, and here's some stuff I got from Jim, and then some stuff that may or may not be accurate. Okay. But that he, obviously was from Franklin Grove, born in 1918, bright, friendly, intelligent, sharp. He loved playing table games. That probably would have served him pretty well with the downtime in the military. They played a lot of cards and games and that sort of thing, particularly for the people that didn't want to go to the bars. And I understand because of family history, he pretty much, I don't know this, but I suspect he did not drink. There were too many people impacted by his father passing away. I found a website on the Franklin Grove High School, of all things, and a picture, early picture. The website is in my sources in the back of this presentation, so you can check it out yourselves. But I did notice that there were some basketball stats, believe it or not, from the 30s. And I don't know this is a stretch, but he was probably in high school, 6 feet, 6'1". He was a tall guy for the 30s. So he might have played basketball. Does anybody know if he played basketball?
Tennis.
I know they play tennis,
Tennis, okay.
picture of my dad and him in the tennis uniform.
Okay. Well, even if he didn't, the stats were kind of interesting. You'll see that the Franklin Grove High School, what's interesting, and I don't know why, but they played in a different district tournament. So it looks like the district changed each year. I don't know what that means exactly, because when I was in high school, I played basketball, and we're in the same district. We just play our district, and if you win that, you get a regional and so on, and then state. But you'll see that these were some dreadfully defensive battles, 32 points, 22, 21 to 4. 4 points in a basketball game? That's some killer defense. But then they finally had some success by winning and getting out in what would have been Bob's senior year. So if he played, or if he rooted them on, whatever, in their senior year, they got through the first round, so that's pretty cool. One note on the Army, Jim mentioned, it's confusing because we have an enlistment record for the Army, and he has an Army serial number. But then 18 months later, he's in the U.S. Army Air Force, or Air Corps, which became U.S. Army Air Force, which became the U.S. Air Force in 1947. So the confusing part is, why was he in the Army, seemingly driving a truck, and then all of a sudden, after a year or so, in the Air Force? Well, if I had to guess, and I should know this, and I think that's how most people got into the U.S. Army Air Force. Unless there were commercial pilots before the war. There were already commercial pilots, and some of them probably went right into flight school. But I think kids knew, wow, these airplanes are amazing, what an adventure of a lifetime, and a lot of them probably applied, and he made it. So I don't think it's too much of a surprise to think that he, after a bit, was like, I'd rather be in the air than on the ground if this thing goes south. And he went through the tests and made, his candidacy to get into the U.S. Army Air Force, which is commendable. The other thing that Jim didn't mention, but I was looking at this picture. Unfortunately, it's a little bit, the resolution's not that great. The view is beautiful. She's gorgeous. So he had a very pretty wife. Okay, training. And it's too bad that that's another chapter. We hopefully can track down her or her family, because she would have information we just don't have access to. And she might even have tangible, we were talking about this last night, letters or uniforms or a footlocker. She would have been the one to get his last personal effects from the airbase in the UK. They would have shipped it back to her. So it'd be really interesting to see if we can track her down, and that'll be the next chapter, right? So Robert Lyman Wasson, he enlisted, as we heard, in 41 from Chicago. Now, again, this just dawned on me. I was doing some work for the U.S. Military Entrance Processing Command, U.S. MEPCOM. And what they do is they're the command for all branches of service. They process all the kids who enlist and process them through all the tests that are required to see if you're capable of entering the military, and then spit you out into a boot camp if you pass. And they spit you out in boot camp. So it's hearing tests, it's eye tests, it's physical tests, it's aptitude tests, everything medical. So I was up here actually in North Chicago, which I didn't realize is a separate city from Chicago. It's an actual city called North Chicago. This is where the command is. That is probably where Bob went to enlist. Or he may have gone to a local enlistment, but it says that he went to Chicago. So he might have gone to a local recruiter in Chicago, but he was, I'm almost positive, he was processed at the place I was at. And they have a library and an archive there. I wasn't there long enough to find the right person to get access, but that's on the list. To get into US MEPCOM and see if I can find any of his actual processing papers. That'd be pretty cool. He was in class 43G for flight training. He received his wings, as we heard, in August of 43. And I'll step through a little bit of that in a couple slides. But essentially they go through 3 phases, varying complexity of aircraft, and then ultimately get assigned to their operational aircraft. And then there's more training for combat in the operational, in the B-24 in this case. And then he received his wings, as I mentioned, in New Mexico. So it's called Alamo Gordo, New Mexico. And he was assigned to the 47th Bomb Group, which was training there. His last furlough to come visit home before they shipped out to Europe was October 1943. These are awesome pictures, and I love the other one that we saw earlier. So this is probably right after he got his wings. He's smiling, see? I know he's smiling because I noticed that he lost a tooth. There's a tooth missing. So that's another story. What happened to that? That's a BT-13 training aircraft. That would have been, it's called the Vultee BT-13 Valiant. And that would have been his basic training, which is actually even though it's called basic, it's the second phase of training. The primary training, which is the first phase, they would have flown a PT-13, a PT-17, or a PT-19 trainer. Probably, well, definitely a single engine, lower horsepower, not as complex, i.e. fixed propeller, probably no tail gear, probably just fixed tail gear. The BT-13 trainer here, I sent this picture into the 47th Bomb Group historians, and they were ecstatic to have a picture of Bob. They put it up on the website, and then, I don't remember, somehow Jim and I were emailing about, what is this thing? It was either Jim or it was one of the historians. This tube here. Let me pause for 1 second. We're going to do a video memory. Good to go? Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. So anyways, this is the level of depth and knowledge that some of these guys and ladies have of these aircraft. And I don't profess to know nearly as much as they do. But emails went around, and finally a guy came back. And he said that tube on the B-13, and this is just from a guy knowing this. He didn't do research. He just emailed the historian back, and the historian emailed. Oh, that tube? That tube is on the B-13. It's a ram air intake. It funnels air through a sealed jacket surrounding the main exhaust pipe, where the air is heated and then directed into the cockpit for cabin heat. It's to heat up the pilot, make it warmer. So it's pretty fascinating stuff when you get into some of the crazy detail. The advanced trainer is the third phase of training. Then they're getting into aircraft that are more like what you would call a warbird. I did a birthday flight when I was 30 in an AT-6, which is one of the types. The Navy version of that is called the SNJ-5. So I was riding back seat. It was before I had my pilot's license. And I was a little bit nervous because I used to have vertigo when I didn't feel secure in a very high place. And so how do you cure that? You have the pilot do some aerobatics. and have the bag ready, you know, just in case. And he did a 4-point turn. I don't know if you know what that is, but you start out wings level, and you basically are doing a barrel roll, but you make 4 stops. So it's level, 1, hold it, 2, hold it, 3, hold it, back level. And on the 3rd one, I grabbed the bag. I didn't use the bag, but I was definitely green. And that made me want to fly. And after that, 2 years after that, I had my license. Not anywhere close to flying that aircraft, but those aircraft, AT-6 and SMJ-5s, are still flying. It's a front back seat, canopy, you know, like you would kind of picture a Warbird, just not as fancy and flashy, or doesn't have the horsepower of like the Mustangs and the Thunderbolts and the P-38s and all that stuff. So then, after that, they go to their B-24s, or their assigned aircraft. So let's move on a little bit. Now we're going to get into the 487th Bomb Group. They actually do have, there were so many bomb groups, so many stories, so many raids, so many theaters in the war. It was a huge war. But the 47th has a very storied past. We saw the, did we see a clip? Or didn't do the clip? I was spacing out, I guess, on the Memphis Belle. We did not do the clip, okay. As a plug, I'm not part of this, but as a plug, there's, if you saw Band of Brothers or Pacific, Tom Hanks and Spielberg put those together for HBO. The 3rd installment is called The Mighty 8, and it'll be the Air War. It'll be the Band of Brothers of the Air War. They're focusing on the 8th Air Force. One raid, which was one of the biggest raids in history, was on Christmas Eve, 1944. The 487th led that raid. So if that makes the series, that would be incredible. And the 487th hopefully will be at least somewhat mentioned, if not featured, if they cover that raid. I can't imagine they would do a series and not cover that raid. It was huge, and it was instrumental in the turn of the war going into 1945. So a little bit about the 47th. I won't rehash what you can read here, but it was activated in 43. They did some practice missions. This information from the practice missions, which I'll get into him later, is from the logbook of the survivor, Ed Grabhorn, or Grab, he was called. So these are some training missions they did. Basically, back in the 30s and 40s, we could be out here and these planes would be flying over. They were doing practice missions across the country. So that's how they practiced. For instruments, for just navigation, duration of the flights. The flights got longer. They were getting ready to go to a theater of war where the durations of these flights were, unbelievable. 8-10 hours round trip. The bomb group ultimately moved to Alamo Gordo, as I mentioned, and then their phases began to get ready for shipping out and going to European theater and combat. One thing about bombers, you'll see pictures, multitudes of pictures. They all have markings. The 47th was called the square P. So they have a square P or box P on their wing, on their vertical stabilizer, on either vertical stabilizer on the outboard panel. And the name Gentlemen from Hell, has anybody ever heard that? The 47th were sort of known as being the Gentlemen from Hell. That was their logo. This is a patch. Now you've probably heard or seen, the bomber jackets in movies and that sort of thing, and they have their fancy patches. Not everybody did that. And then some of them drew on the back with their number of bomb runs. They would put a new bomb on or whatever, or sometimes the bombs were on the front. This would have been, this patch is made out of leather. You You can still get them made the original way. There's a guy in Italy that makes them. They burn all this into, it's not, they somehow burn in the edging, and then they paint it over the leather. And then they would have put that right here. And then 8th Air Force, they would have had some patches for 8th Air Force on their sleeves. Not everybody wore this, so it wasn't like an official 47 emblem patch, but a lot of the guys in Alamogordo that were there originally, Bob being one, may or may not have had this, but certainly were calling themselves the Gentlemen from Hell. And because these British soldiers were there training, I guess, I don't know why they would have been there, but they were waiting, as the 47th was waiting to ship out to Europe, these British soldiers noted, "This place is hotter than hell, and this place is no place for a gentleman." And one of the veterans that was there replied, "Well, I guess that makes us the Gentlemen from Hell," and it stuck. And that story is from one of these books. And there are variants on the patch too. Sometimes the flames are a little more blue. But you see he has a devil with a top hat and a tux. Pretty cool. And then shipping out, I had intended to take Google Earth and plot the coordinates so you could visually see this course. It's probably somewhere. I just didn't have time to pull it together or find it. But this is the path they took to get to Lavenham, England. And there's a name for the route they took. It was a southern route, but there was also a nickname for it, which I apologize, I don't remember. I can dig it up. It's in one of those books. But notably, in Alamogordo, they transitioned that base after these two bomb groups left to train B-29s. So the B-29s are like the Enola Gay, the ones that dropped the big bomb and really turned the tide of the war for us. I have documents about the actual orders, their orders for shipping out, activating the group, and then shipping them out. They left Harrington, Kansas, and headed for Florida, which is about here. And then from Florida to Trinidad to a couple places in Brazil. Sometimes there's two places mentioned because there's so many aircraft that they had to take two airfields. Brazil to West Africa, Marrakesh in Morocco, and then they flew west of Portugal. So they were basically flying, if you can envision it, Jim had that one picture of the world, but all the way around Portugal to get back up to UK just to avoid Luftwaffe. And then they ended up, some of them went to Scotland, and then some of them went to Ireland to stage until they could go to Lavenham. I think I read that the group that he was in, the planes landed at this RAF air base, and then some guy's like, "What are you looking for?" And they said, "We're looking for Station 127. And he's like, "Oh, I know where that is. I'm getting ready to head that way anyway. Why don't you just follow me?" He was in a fighter, and he led them to their air base. And so they actually ended up there the same day. You can see that. And that was a whole new world for a lot of these kids. One notable thing about the movements, this was the crew that moved with Bob overseas. Oh, at one point, the officers flew the planes over. The crews and probably the gunners. The crews that serviced the planes had to take a ship. So they showed up, they left a lot earlier or showed up a lot later. But the plane, the guys on the plane would fly the planes over. The mechanics and stuff would come over by ship. But anyway, one interesting thing about this crew, being the crew that went over with Bob, and you see here, co-pilot. Now, code for what their duty is. 1024 is a pilot. So as the war progressed, a lot of the co-pilots ended up with their own ships because guys were getting shot down, people were sick, they needed more pilots. So ultimately, he probably would have ended up as a pilot as the war progressed. But in this case, so that's why he has the same rating as the pilot. His duties are very similar to the pilot, which we'll see in a minute. But notably, this Gerald Ganoon, who I can't seem to find too much about, flew over with them as a navigator. So he was in the original crew of 8785, crew 8785. But also, the navigator that went down with them that survived, Grabhorn, on their way over to Europe, they had a crash in Georgia. They landed, and I think their hydraulics went out, and they couldn't brake. And they ran off the end of the runway, which is shown here. And I can't tell from this picture. One of those might be Grab. But they, you can see, broke into many, many pieces. He said that they all should have been dead. So he had already crashed once, near fatal. Everybody was fine. They had some bumps and scrapes and bruises and that kind of stuff. But I thought that was an interesting tidbit, was that they already had an accident. So his crew, which was the brown crew, can I say that there? Also coincidentally, the plane that crashed was called the Consolidated Mess. Which brings up another point. Not all planes had their pet name or the fancy, half-naked lady painted on the side. There were strict regulations actually not to do that. Early on, early on, there was a lot of that. It was hit or miss whether or not planes had it. But later on, they kind of stopped doing that because the Luftwaffe started to recognize who was who and would go after certain planes that they knew would make a bigger impact. Like they knew which planes, they knew about the Memphis Belle. They knew which planes were getting ready to cycle through their 35 missions. So they'd target them if they knew who the planes were. It's more so in terms of the fighter pilots, but with the bombers too, it just wasn't safe to identify yourself that way. This is the crew ultimately that ended up flying together under Willis. Willis is the pilot. The second lieutenant, again, when he made the Army Air Forces, he would have been commissioned as second lieutenant. So he was probably a private or a corporal or whatever he was in the Army. As soon as he got those wings, he was a second lieutenant. That's how they commission it. I know really very little about any of these other guys other than Brad. This Robert Donnelly, the tail gunner, he has a relative that's been on email and emailed me several years ago, and I tried to email her back to help her learn more about this and get whatever information she had, and I never heard back from her. But then I saw another email that she posted on the 47th Facebook page, and I think she's still alive. Maybe it's too difficult for her to, go back into this stuff. I don't know why. Some people just aren't interested. That was history. I don't really care. But I'm still, it's on my list to try to track down anything really from these other guys too. Because I probably know a lot about what happened and that they haven't ever heard before.
Obscure the whole thing.
I think it was probably obscure at that point. They knew, once they woke the sleeping dog, the U.S. was sending millions of guys to UK equipment. We were already doing Lend-Lease programs with UK for airplanes and boats. There were British guys that flew B-24s. So the Germans knew it was coming, but the the specific details of, what groups were flying and when they were arriving, all that stuff, I don't think they,
Well, it's pretty much
they were
out
kind
there.
of focused on, they're starting to get focused on Russia, and the whole Eastern Front. And after Battle of Britain, they kind of focused on Russia. So it wasn't as much on, they knew if England got in the war and they couldn't win Battle of Britain, it was going to be, huge. But, yeah, I don't think they knew that much detail. But again, I don't know. I'll follow up. I'll try to find out. I'm a little behind because, like I said, I warned you, I rambled. So the next couple of sections are kind of more technical, just because I'm interested in their airplane and that sort of thing. It kind of ties into the story about what really happened on the day they were shot down. So I'll kind of go through it a little bit quicker. But like I said, if there's something that I go through too fast, we'll figure out a way to make this available. And the information's either in the slides or in my notes. And by all means, ask questions. The plane they flew is a B-24 Liberator, made by Consolidated Aircraft. There was a plant in Flint, Michigan. I don't want to, this is just some Wikipedia stuff. You can look it up yourself. That $297,000 to build one unit is like $4.85 million in today's dollars. One thing about it, though, is that the movie Memphis Belle, not the documentary Memphis Belle, but the movie Memphis Belle is an absolute, I'm not judging, but it's an absolute example of how the B-17 always got the glory. And it was a sticking point with pilots that flew B-24s. Why can't we have the B-17s? The fact of the matter is that the B-24 was produced more than any four-engine, multi-engine, and bomber aircraft ever in the history of the world. They simply made more than the B-17s. But the B-17 was an advanced aircraft in terms of being easier on the pilot. The B-24 was notably very difficult to fly. It took literally a lot of physical input to control the plane. So when I was mentioning they were flying 8 to 10 hours, I'm talking about go to Walmart and grab a shopping cart and grab onto it as tight as you can for 10 hours. That's what it's going to feel like. Every muscle in their body is trying to control that airplane. It was just excruciating. And that's why they trained a whole lot. And that's why they had two pilots. It had 10 machine guns, 50 caliber. They flew the H model, which introduced what they called the greenhouse on this picture over here. I think this is a J model, but it had the greenhouse as well. So they made sort of a greenhouse on the nose turret as opposed to being like a fixed set of two machine guns. They had more maneuverability left and right, up and down on the H model. So not that many changes really. That's a pretty cool picture because you can kind of see all the inner workings of the B-24 and where everybody sits, where everybody is positioned, and where all the bombs are, and all that stuff. This is an easier one on the eyes, but this shows the crew positions. Bob flew co-pilot, so Bob was right here. That's Bob. They sit kind of on an elevated platform, and notably on this picture as well, these are fuel tanks, and that's going to come into play later. Engines from left to right, 1, 2, 3, 4. From port to starboard, just in a row. Number 1, 2, 3, 4. That'll come into play later too. I'm definitely not going to spend too much time on this, but this is interesting information. What I was trying to portray. This is an excerpt transcription from the B-24 manual, which I actually found online, the actual manual. And it explains the different duties. I do not expect you to be able to read this. It's just the print is too small. But for every position on the airplane, of which there were 10, it has what the duties were for that person. Knowing through my training for just a little Cessna, you do things and you practice them over and over and over and over and over so that they become instinct and automatic, particularly emergencies. You don't have time to go through a checklist, although you do have your checklist handy, if something happens. You have to instinctively do it. And so that's my intent for these next few slides, to kind of show what they would have been trained on and what they would have known instinctively. Co-pilot duties are shown here. The co-pilot actually got a lot of the brunt work in terms of getting the plane ready to fly. So some of that is just, there are two pilots, so both of them don't need to do it, and some of it is like, well, he was co-pilot, and the pilot doesn't want to have to go through all that stuff and write up everything, so we'll make the co-pilot do it. But in any case, the co-pilot not only had to be a pilot, but he had to run through all the different checklists for pre-flight. When I was going, which I found in the manual, and when I was going through the checklist, I was like, man, this is incredibly similar to a mid-70s Cessna 172. Aviation really hasn't changed that much. It's incredible. Here's a picture of the cockpit. It looks really busy, and that's because it is. There's 4 of everything. So you have 4 engines. You're going to have 4 knobs, throttle, 4 knobs for trim, 4 knobs, or for carb heat, for mixture. I mean, it's basically everything they need to fly one engine, they're going to need 4. So it's really complicated. One thing that we may see later, while I have it on here, I'll just mention it, but there were some guys, they write up what's called a squawk sheet, and we do that too. When you come back from your flight, what was wrong with the aircraft? And you make a note of it so that the mechanics can go fix it. And one thing that some guys continually complained about was the compass up here and the heading indicator. You can see they kind of sit in the way. You can't really see straight out of the cockpit. That could be a problem, right? But seemingly from the pilot's view and the co-pilot's view, they're scanning this way and that way, helping each other visually, but still it's an annoyance. Here's specs, again, just Wikipedia this stuff. Notably, it had a bigger payload than a B-17. It could fly farther than a B-17. It did not take